Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to our third Thales Press webinar entitled Loving and Learning Latin with Will Begley. My name is Winston Brady, and I'm a humanities teacher and the Dean of Academics at Thales Academy. I'm going to try to keep my opening remarks brief, but I did want to say a few words of introduction about our special guest, Will. Will grew up in Georgia, Vermont, where he was homeschooled up until 7th grade. He attended Davidson College in Davidson, North Carolina, where he majored in classics. He later went on to receive a master's in Latin and a Ph.D. in classical and medieval Latin, both from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. He's been teaching at Thales Academy for 5 years, and I can personally attest that he knows as much about English poetry as he does about Latin poetry, having listened to him lead some great discussions for the past 2 years on the Thales podcast on the subject. And most recently, Will has become a father. He and his wife, Becca, just had their first child, a baby boy named Paul, this past summer. So welcome, Will, and thank you again for preparing this talk. I can't think of a better, more relevant topic than helping students love the things that are worth loving, Latin being chief amongst them.
Hello, everyone. I am Alexandra Stroud. I am going to be facilitating the Q&A at the very end of this webinar, and I just wanted to give you guys a few ground rules before we start. So first and foremost, thank you for coming, Will. And again, everyone who's joined, thank you for joining. As questions arise during the webinar, please go ahead and just write them down and save any you might have until we get closer to the end of the presentation, and that will be marked by the question slide, and then send them to the chat box. We do this just in case our speaker ends up answering your questions along the way. We will have a brief Q&A at the end of the webinar, and although we may not get through all of the questions, if you add your name and email address at the end of the submission, we will be sure to follow up with an answer via email. All of our webinars will be placed in our Thales Press page and our YouTube as well. So if you would like to revisit our conversation from tonight or to share it with your friends, please feel free. We will let you know when the video is posted via an email sent to you. And please also feel free to contact Winston with any other questions about this series. His email address will be posted at the end of the presentation. All right. And with no further ado, I will leave it to you.
Thank you very much, Alexandra. Thank you, Winston. Just a quick disclaimer before I start. When I was asked to do this episode, I was told the title of the talk first before I got the blurb saying what the talk would cover. So I'm going to go mostly on the title of the talk. I'm going to talk about why Latin is worth learning, and then I'm going to talk about how I came to love Latin, and if some of the audiences out there is fellow Latin teachers, some guesses I have about how possibly we can start helping our students love Latin too. If there is any information that you're hoping to hear that I don't get to in the course of the talk, please do send questions in the chat, and I'll do my best to get to all of them, whether viva voce or by email later. So, right. The number one question students of Latin and teachers of Latin have to deal with on a regular basis is why on earth they're taking it in the first place. And so I'll be going into in the talk. I'll start with what those extrinsic reasons are, the reasons that we almost always lead with when we're telling people why to take Latin, talking about the utility of Latin. I'd also like to talk about some intrinsic reasons that I feel like are not used as often when this conversation comes up, but I think are by and large the more important reasons to consider taking Latin. And I would like to go into, as I said at the end, I'd like to talk about how to make Latin easier to love, both by covering what the current obstacles are to students developing a love for Latin in middle and high school. And then just a reminder to myself and to all Latin teachers to focus on the ultimate goal of a Latin class, picking up again on the extrinsic and intrinsic reasons I'm planning to talk about. So nearly every Latin teacher and nearly every Latin student has had to deal with some amount of incredulity when it comes up in conversation that they take or teach Latin. The responses are pretty varied, but I would say most of them fall under one or the other of the umbrellas of either Latin is a dead language, who on earth are you going to talk to? Usually these people are perhaps a little on the more skeptical side. And then there's some people who give you the benefit of the doubt, and they admit that perhaps it could come in handy if you are planning to go into legal professions or medical professions. Many of them will also add as an afterthought that I guess you could always teach if you're really scraping the bottom of the barrel as far as professions go. I think both of these these objections are reasonable and they're common. They both have something at their premise that's really worth exploring. The people who project their incredulity about the usefulness of Latin by saying that it's a dead language, the premise there obviously is that language is for communication. If you're learning a dead language as opposed to Spanish, where you can you can talk to your neighbors down the street, perhaps you can go to Madrid and order paella, there's very obvious payoffs to everybody all along the line, from early language students to adults. It's very clear what the goal of studying Spanish will be. The idea here is that Latin can no longer be used to communicate with people. Therefore, Latin is not worth taking. We'll come back and talk about that premise in a moment. The premise of the second one, the often more polite one about the handiness of Latin, is that the reason to do anything in school is to set you up in the future for employment prospects. That basically school is designed to be a direct line to your future career. School is designed to be largely a commercial undertaking. So let me address let's address both of them at the same time. Let's talk about the extrinsic use of Latin and why both people, I think, are sometimes satisfied by answers to their objections to Latin. The most commonly cited example of the usefulness of Latin is Latin's obvious influence on the Romance languages. In fact, beyond an influence in the Romance languages, Latin essentially is the Romance languages. The Romance languages grew directly from Latin. Generally, Latin-speaking populations, as the Roman Empire fell and they became isolated from a sort of a standard Roman center, the dialects became stronger and stronger until eventually those dialects turned into languages that would be mutually not understandable to people who spoke other dialects. As Europe developed colonies across the globe, they spread their Romance languages. And so you can see green obviously is Spanish, orange is Portuguese, blue is French, all these remnants of Latin spread across the globe. So for anybody who is interested in learning a Romance language, they'll find that serious study of Latin sets them up not only to learn those languages in their own right, but even gives them the opportunity to dabble in those languages in less of a directed way. My own study of Latin has made it possible, and I talk to other Latinists who find the same thing, that they can read the newspaper in Italian, they can stumble through a French cookbook that's written in French, mostly by virtue of their knowledge of Latin vocabulary and syntax, which still survives with pretty predictable morphological changes going from Latin into those Romance languages. Further extrinsic reasons include the way that Latin gives you an overview of all language. Not only does Latin help you learn a Romance language because the Romance languages grew directly from Latin. Let's say you want to learn Chinese, which has no direct connection to the Latin language. The fact that you have learned a difficult inflected language in studying Latin makes it much easier for you to learn other languages in the future, whether or not they're related. If you can deal with the complicated inflections and syntax of Latin, you are more aware of the differences from language to language, and you are better able to pick up on other languages. Mandarin, for instance, has a pitch accent. That's very difficult to pick up for speakers of languages who don't have a pitch accent. But if you're aware of the generic differences between languages, it becomes much more easy to understand the process by which one learns languages. An analogy I like to use is for musicians. If you studied the piano first, you have not only a knowledge of playing piano, and you could play piano for someone, you could play them a song they like, you also have a sense of music theory that doesn't necessarily come with every other instrument. You can see laid out in front of you the relation between notes. You can see laid out in front of you what chords look like. And so if you were to move to a different instrument, you have an understanding of music theory that comes from the particular sort of instrument you grew up playing. I know of one case, someone I know from the same master's program I did eventually ended up working for the NSA, for instance, not because he already had any particular expertise they needed, but they knew that he had learned Latin. They knew he had learned ancient Greek. They needed somebody who knew Turkish, and they did not, there's not many people in the United States who study Turkish. Their thought was, we need to find someone who can learn a language quickly and learn a language well. And he only recently retired with awards, I think, from the NSA after a long time dealing with intelligence that required Turkish language knowledge. Even languages that don't work in the sense that we're used to thinking of languages, computer coding, for instance. I have heard of a lot of other classmates from the past and colleagues from the past who have gone into coding. And again, the fact of having studied a rigorous and logical language has set them up perfectly, never to miss a closed parentheses in their computer coding, or never to miss a bracket. They have, again, laid out in front of them, they have an idea of what language consists in, and they have an idea of the sort of underlying backbone to language, that rather than just the manifestations in a particular language. Beyond learning languages, Latin teaches you how to learn, period. And I think this is one of the biggest extrinsic reasons to take Latin. I have found that for every parent at an open house who wants to know why the school bothers to offer Latin, there are exactly 0 parents who ask why the school bothers to offer math. And again, not to cast any shade in the direction of my beloved colleagues in math, but the fact is they're in a similar position. Very few people are going to grow up to become a professional mathematician. If school is designed to employ you, then any math beyond the operation of a calculator would seem to be unnecessary. But math, like Latin, teaches you how to go through a process involving some knowns and some unknowns. And math teaches you how to use what you do know to illuminate what you don't know. Latin does exactly the same thing. Latin is heavily logical in its structure. It's very rigorous, and it's different enough from English that it presents students with a challenge of taking a small amount that they do know about the sentence in front of them, and using that small amount they do know to make logical inferences that leads them to an understanding of the totality. I've told some of my colleagues that if it offered the same advantages that Latin does in this respect, I would happily teach them Klingon. There's really any number of reasons that Latin shows you how to take a class, shows you how to understand the nuances both of learning another language and of learning really anything difficult in the first place. I'm noticing we have a hand raise. Is that a okay? All right. Beyond the extrinsic use of Latin, though, I'm really more interested in what is it about Latin in particular that is good, and why it is that I am interested in teaching Latin and, for instance, not Klingon. The people on the why learn Latin, who on earth are you going to talk to, and rude as they occasionally are right in that language is for communication. That is the reason language exists. That's one of the particular things that makes humans humans, is that they have developed this incredibly complex system to communicate with each other. I completely agree with them that language is for communication, but the same reasons that apply to learning Spanish, that is, you can talk to somebody of a different culture and of a different place, those do in fact apply to Latin. You're just adding the extra dimension of you're talking to somebody from a different time. Latin, more than any other language I've encountered, enables you to instead of crossing the Atlantic Ocean to be able to talk to cultures on the other side of it, this Latin enables you to cross the ocean of the 2 millennia or so that intervene with us and most of the authors we read in Latin. There is an understandable bias in everyone's mind in favor of the people who they can physically talk to now, but as G.K. Chesterton, I think, basically said, just because somebody's been dead for a long time does not disqualify their opinion. Latin gives you the opportunity to converse more or less directly with somebody that you would not be able to communicate with otherwise, because you're willing to come to them. You're willing to bring, again, to use what you do know to illuminate what you don't, and to move into their language and into their idiom, into their way of expressing themselves, which is really the best possible way to communicate with people with whom you would otherwise be unable to communicate. Just as a quick example of what I mean, I was reading the other day. Let's see, I guess I'll get all the pictures up here. We got John Henry Newman in the center, is a 19th century English clergyman, and in his Grammar of Assent, just as a point on the side about the way different people from different times assent to things, he quotes "Dulce et decorum est pro patria mori." This is a tag from Horace, whom you can see grinning over there on the left. Newman quotes this as an indication of when Horace wrote this originally, his readers would have had a particular understanding of what this line means. It is sweet and it is honorable, or it is decorous to die on behalf of your country. For what Newman argues is, for Horace's original readers, this would have a particular meaning because many of them had just fought in a civil war that had torn Rome apart, a whole series of civil wars that had torn Rome apart in the 1st century BC. And so their ascent would be like near them in memory. They would know people who had in fact died on behalf of their country. They would know people who perhaps died on the other side as well. Newman is saying that school children in England in the 19th century, all of whom would have been classically educated, or all the ones who received an education would have been classically educated and would have read Horace as a matter of course in their schools. They also would assent to this in that they would know the raw meaning of the words, and they would have a different conception, not having been in a war in recent memory. They would have a different conception of what that line would mean. If you fast forward another 50 years to the top of the screen, at the Arlington Memorial Cemetery at the Memorial Amphitheater, you can see faintly at the top of the screen there, Dulce et decorum est pro patria mori. Here it's quoted as a memorial to fallen soldiers from World War I. This was put up, I think, in the mid to late 19-teens. And this was, here it's using Horace again as an indication of it's an endorsement of the sentiment here. It's borrowing Horace to show that even now, after all these millennia, the same principle applies here, the same desire for honor, the same desire to memorialize something about war that was true in Horace's time and is carried on through into the present day. And then on the right, you have Wilfred Owen, who just a couple years after the Arlington Memorial Amphitheater was put up, wrote a poem called Dulce et decorum est. And he takes the same epigram from Horace and he ironizes it and comes at it from a completely different point of view. He gives a lengthy description of the horrors of war and the misery of dying from a mustard gas attack. And the poem ends with talking about how people have been tricked into believing that old lie, Dulce et decorum est pro patria mori. In the same war, you have the same epigram from Horace being used in radically different ways, but both of them are looking back to this one particular point of commonality that's been echoing through the centuries to this point. They're all joining in the same conversation, and even though no two entities on the screen are alive at the same time, they're all talking to each other, and the effort put into learning Latin lets you become a member of that conversation. It lets you read Newman and understand what he's talking about, and it lets you think ahead of Newman into the Wilfred Owen poem, so you can know what he's talking about. It gives you this key into a room where there's been this millennia-long uninterrupted conversation happening all about the same words. I'd also like to take a minute to talk about what has surely arisen in the minds of a few people, which is that if that sentiment is timeless and if that sentiment is holding true across millennia, is it really necessary to learn Latin? Couldn't you learn what Dulce et decorum est means? Couldn't you, in fact, learn you could learn the sentiment transcribed there in English? For example, you can see on the screen, this is pages from a Loeb Classical Library volume, which for a long time now has printed the ancient language on the left page and the English translation on the right. What's wrong with just reading this in translation? And I do have to say, I'm very appreciative of people who translate ancient language as well and bring the past to more people who would get to read it. Reading ancient literature in translation is far preferable to not reading it at all. That said, the English translation of something is not equivalent to the Latin. In fact, no translation is an equivalence. I think sometimes people who don't deal with languages a great deal can get into the habit of thinking of language as sort of it's just meant to express a thought, and so each word can be transferred into another language using exact word for word sort of a transcription. Each word has an equivalent, and it will work the same in the next language. I suppose this could be true for instruction manuals. I don't know if it would be true anywhere else. Anything that makes a language a particular language, all the sonic effects, metaphor, wordplay, the connotation of words, all those things are very important to a language, and they are a part of the communication. The communication is always more than the bald words of something, and without that added dimension that makes the language a particular language, you are in fact losing something. Just to borrow an analogy from Dr. James Connolly, if you think of the original text of something as a painting, if you had to describe this painting to somebody who had never seen it before, you could tell them that there's a sun and some stars and some cypress trees, and it's swirlier than the average painting. You could tell them all those things. That does not mean they've seen the painting. Even if you reproduce the painting, the best you can really hope for realistically in a translation is a facsimile of some part of the painting. You can show exactly what is in the painting in the sense that you can show the subject of the painting, but that it's impossible in a translation to carry over all the things that work together to make up the painting. Anyone who has seen the black and white reproduction on the right has not actually seen Starry Night. You've only seen Starry Night if you've seen the actual painting. In fact, I'm sure a more rigorous art historian than myself would object to me showing pictures of the painting at all. You haven't seen the painting until you've seen the very painting itself with the brush strokes visible, with everything that goes into making that work of art a work of art. But all this is true literarily as well. Just to give you an example that's come up recently in my 11th grade class. Back to Horace. I can't resist Horace. I'm a Horace fan. We've been reading an ode. It's usually called the Pyrrha Ode because it's addressed to a woman named Pyrrha. The speaker of the poem is imagining himself looking at Pyrrha, who is currently cavorting with her new lover. And the first line is set up, quis multa gracilis te puer in rosa. Even a beginning Latin student will be able to go through and figure out, okay, the exact, the word for word translation of each of these words is easy enough. You can just go through and you're going to end up with a word for word, point by point line of gibberish, because what many slender you boy and rose is not intelligible English. That would be the most basic Latinist who really only knows vocab. The Latinist who knows sentence structure is better able to see, okay, gracilis must be modifying puer, multa must be modifying rosa, and they can set it up. The verb, which is delayed in the next line, not showed here, means to hold or to press against or something along those lines. So a better Latinist will be able to say, okay, what slender boy holds you in many a rose or amid many roses? And now they're better able to say, okay. And in most Latin programs, this is where we stop. We get to this point and we say, okay, we've finished, we've got our translation. And we have this habit of thinking of Latin as the unresolved fraction, and we're not done until we put it into English. But this poem is a really good example of all the other effects, all the rhythmic and sonic effects you can use in language that transcend the mere meaning of the words. You'll notice here that the word for you is smack dab in the middle of the line here metrically. You'll notice that it's being surrounded by the words referring to the boy. And then around both of them, you have the words referring to the roses. What Horace has done, while still maintaining a rigorous and difficult to hear for English speakers meter, in addition to a metrically perfect line, what he's done is he's shown you what's going on pictorially. He's used something that's particular to Latin. He's used the oddness of Latin's inflected language system to show you what's going on. He has the option of putting the words nearly wherever he wants because the inflected endings of the word will show the function of the word. And so he's able to show that the boy is surrounding Pyrrha, and he's able to show that both of them are sitting in this bed of roses. He's done sort of a picture painting that could be done in English, but it would have to be done much differently because we don't inflect the same way that Latin does. And so we're sort of imprisoned by word order in a way that Horace is not. Horace has this freedom to show off this extra effect that Latin can do that no translation would be able to capture. Along the same lines, later in that same poem, the speaker continues to imagine this new lover of Pyrrha's. And so just I'll do a rough translation for you, left to right here. So this is this new lover who now enjoys you, trusting that you're gold, who hopes that you will always be at leisure, who hopes that you will always be lovable, but he's unaware of the deceptive breeze. In a large sense, that may sound a little like gibberish in English as well. You maybe can get a rough sense of the idea, but that's a black and white painting compared to what Horace is actually doing here. you'll notice the word amabilem, for instance, at the end of the second line. In Latin, that can mean lovable. You can see that same bull suffix coming into English through French. That's another example of the intrinsic or the extrinsic reasons to learn Latin. It'll help with your English vocabulary thanks to English's frequent embezzlements from Romance languages. But in addition to meaning lovable, it can also mean able to love. Horace is using a word that is intentionally ambiguous. He has a word that could mean two things that are related but not the same. If you read enough Horace, you get the sense that this is something he does frequently and intentionally, where he picks the perfect word that has the perfect ambiguity to express two things at the same time, or perhaps even something in between them. Look up at the end of the first line where he talks about aurea. This word means gold. You can see, if you know your periodic table, you know Au is the atomic symbol for gold. Aurea is describing Pyrrha, and it's calling back an earlier part of the poem where he describes her hair as flawa, that is sort of golden colored, flaxen colored. And so when the new lover thinks of Pyrrha as being golden, it calls into play both the earlier part of the poem, which is a physical description of Pyrrha, but also it calls into play all the poetic associations with gold. Gold is beautiful. Gold is permanent in a way that almost nothing else in the ancient world would have been. Gold is untarnishable. And so the lover currently believes that Pyrrha is always going to be this sort of beautiful, untarnishable, permanent part of his life. He hopes that she will always be free, always be lovable. But what he's unaware of nearly at the end of the line here is he's unaware of the deceptive breeze. The word aura, we get aura in English from it, is a word for a light wind. This is picking up from the stanza before, a description Horace had of storm clouds and rough seas and a gale. He calls back to that earlier part of the poem where he's used a storm as a metaphor for Pyrrha's new relationship being on the rocks. And again, the breeze, just as gold signified permanence, the breeze calls into play that poetic idea of impermanence and fickleness, and it even can be a presage of that storm that Horace has talked about before. A translation can get across some part of that. A translation could show you some of those poetic associations. A translation could indicate to you the connections from one part of a poem to another. But unless you are a probably superhuman translator into any language, you can't get across that aurea and aurai are anagrams of each other. And he's delayed them towards near the end of the line to heighten this comparison between these two words. He thinks that she's aurea. He thinks that she's permanent and golden. She turns out to be fickle like a breeze, aurai. By just transposing two letters, Horace has shown a commonality between two unrelated Latin words. He's shown what you can do with poetry. He's shown what you can do with poetry in your native language. As Ezra Pound says, a good definition of poetry might be what is untranslatable. Horace has given us an example of the untranslatable aspect of Latin poetry. And so, as you can tell, I'm a Horace fan, and so I think this brings me to the last of the intrinsic reasons to take Latin. I find that if one is in extreme, we'll get to this in the next point, but if one is in extreme haste to turn school into a pure preparation for employment, you run into the problem that Randall Munroe, the author of XKCD, has run into here, which is that viewing school in purely instrumental terms means you're essentially cutting yourself out of a huge part of your life. As the caption to the left says, it's weird how proud people are of not learning math when the same arguments apply to learning to play music, cook, or speak a foreign language. You can replace math with Latin, and the same holds true. The only things you have to know are how to make enough of a living to stay alive and how to get your taxes done. All the fun parts of life are optional. Latin is fun, and if you can get to the stage in Latin where you can sit down, for instance, with the Pyrrha Ode and start to see some of the intense meaning that's been crammed into just a small poem with a few words, you start to realize how fun this can be for its own sake. And again, this is why I don't teach Klingon. There is actual communication. There's 2 uninterrupted millennia of communication in Latin, and it's enjoyable to be able to read that. If you're reading great literature in its original language, that is a fun thing. Whether or not it ends up being part of your future employment. The fun parts of life are optional. Take that option. You owe it to yourself to make the most of the of the time you have to really fall in love with something, even if you don't have to do it, even if you're not strictly obliged to do it. Recently, an author in the UK named Giles Fraser wrote an article on the value of Latin for this very reason. And he pointed out that the word education has a certain semantic overload to it. We think of education as being coterminous with schooling in some cases. And his point is we also think of it being coterminous with training. He says that education that's designed to meet some specific economic end is not education, but training. If you are doing something solely for its earning potential, that would be training for a job. And that's an important thing, but it's not quite the same thing as education. It's an instrumentalization of something that should be loved for its own sake. Replying to that same article, the Bishop of Worcester pointed out that in that respect, education is really less like training than it is like a friendship. If you are entering into a friendship solely for the way you could instrumentalize it, you're doing it wrong. If you are going into Latin because you're going to make a lot of money, first, I have bad news for you. But second, it's not really the reason to do it. If you're entering into it because you get some satisfaction for the exquisite placement of words that Horace can make use of, given that he's using his language to its utmost, that is more like a friendship. That is something that you can appreciate for its own sake. So preparation for work is training, very important. That is something that Latin can help with in a very ancillary and secondary way. Preparation for all the parts of your life that are not dictated by your commercial value and your value as a consumer or a producer in society, that's the part that's actually in education. And when we conflate the two, we run the risk of missing out on the education part of education and moving directly to training. That's largely why I love Latin. But as I assume numerous people in this webinar who also teach Latin have no doubt found, not all of our students come in loving Latin. Many of our students leave also not loving Latin. A lot of them view it as drudgery, especially if it's a class that's mandatory. And then even some of the ones that sign up for it voluntarily find that there are large swaths of class that are just not fun. Some of this is a little bit unavoidable. Some people are always going to find parts of school not fun because they have to be there and they could be somewhere else. But there are, I think, points of it where it does bear examination, and Latin teachers have to look carefully at our own practice to make sure that we are at least considering the possibility that Latin could be fun for our students as well as for us. The major obstacles I've noticed in the last few years, and I should mention I'm no expert in teaching Latin. I just have run into particular problems in my own classes, and I would be curious to hear from my fellow teachers if they happen to see the same thing in their classrooms. But I've noticed that there are students who are fantastic math students, and they come into Latin and they love parts of it. They love the charts and they love the order and they love the mechanics of the language. But then when it comes to the exceptions to the rules and the weirdnesses of Latin, they start to recuse themselves from full enjoyment of the language because they want it to be more consistent than it in fact is. On the other hand, you have people who have wonderful ears for language, and they come in excited for a language that they don't know yet. Maybe I have a lot of students who come in with more than one language already, and they come into Latin and they find the way they learned their earlier languages is not how language is learned. And so it's not I'm sorry, this should say it's not just logic. It's not just log. They find that it's not the same as the way they picked up, say, Spanish at home. It is a much more regimented syntax, and there is more memorization of the underlying grammar early on than there is, say, spoken language than there is conversations in class. There's also, I find, in many Latin programs, I think my own included still, although I'm trying to work away from this, there's an overemphasis of grammar relative to an emphasis on reading. Because the grammar is so foundational in Latin, the first several years of Latin class is very often nearly entirely centered on grammar, and there's very little reading of actual Latin. Occasionally, there will be maybe a short story from Ecce Romani that the students pummel their way through, but the bulk of class, the lectures, the worksheets, and the tests and the reviews are all focused on grammar. They're focused on charts. this is probably the elephant in the Zoom room for the Latin teachers here, but there's kind of a civil war going on now between the traditional teachers of Latin who use what's often called the grammar translation method, which privileges grammar. And again, the goal of the class is to move Latin into English. And that's when you know you're done. You can dust off your hands. And then on the other hand, there's the people who favor comprehensible input, where they say that, you know, Latin is a language and should be learned as other languages are, and focuses much more heavily on producing language, using vocabulary actively, having conversations in class out loud, perhaps even conducting the class in Latin is becoming more and more popular. And the latter group tends to refer to the former group as the drill and kill school, and the former group tends to denigrate the latter group as people who don't really care about how far we get, don't care if we end up able to read Virgil by the end of senior year. I'm not here to take a side in that conflict. I think there's a lot of merit in both of those camps, and I kind of wish we could all get along on this point. I know our school has been working hard on trying to find a via media there, where we could get to rigorous reading towards the end of high school without turning it into an interest killing. You got to know all these charts by this point of 6th grade. We're trying to walk that line at my school constantly. And I'll talk a little bit about some tentative ways we started to go about finding a way in between those two camps. But that does lead, I think, to one of the problems that I've noticed at our school. At our school, Latin is required from 6th to 8th grade. And then in 9th grade, students have the option of switching to Spanish or taking Latin. 6th through 8th grade, by and large, are they're laying that foundation, and they're leaning heavily on teaching grammar. They're leaning heavily on the underlying syntax. The problem with that is it's a little bit as if you hired people to, plant your field and to grow your crop for you. And then before the grain could be harvested, I'm really giving away that I'm not a farmer here, aren't I? Before the grain could be harvested and magically turned into bread and enjoyed, all the people who have really, struggled the most with Latin in middle school have switched over to Spanish. And so they end up putting in large amounts of reasonably drudgy work, and they don't get the reward of getting to Latin that's enjoyable, getting to Latin that's worth reading. So to address these problems, to get people sooner into the joys of Latin, to get people to appreciate quicker, these are just some ideas that we've run into that we've been implementing the last few years at Thales Academy. And again, I would love to hear from other Latin teachers to hear what they're doing. One of the first points is we've found it very helpful to get students reading Latin in larger doses all at a time. We happen to be living in a golden age, thanks to people like Lance Piantagini and Andrew Olympi and numerous others. We're in a golden age for Latin novellae, which are original. It's almost always Latin teachers who are writing these. It's an original story. Often they're drawn from mythology, and the point of the novellae is to, the point of the novellae is to repeat vocab as often as possible. So if you look in the upper right corner of the books in the top row, Lance Piantagini has given an idea of the number of distinct words in the text. Rufus Lutulentus only has 20 different words in the entire book. This is a favorite of my 6-year-old niece who's currently learning Latin. She's been reading the Rufus books, and she loves them because she can understand them right away because there's heavy reliance on cognates. And the idea is she's able to read large swaths of it at a time, not having to struggle through sentence by sentence, finding verbs, finding subjects, finding objects, thinking about charts. She's reading it fluidly, and therefore assimilating, at least in part, the grammar. And she's getting it into her head that Latin is a language that can be communicated in, and that it's an enjoyable language. By the same token, in the last 50 to 60 years, there's been a spate of books that have been, I think, starting with Winnie Ilepu, there's been a spate of beloved books that have been translated into Latin. Terence Thunberg and Milena Minkovic, I think, have done a couple of these. But if there's an extremely well-loved children's book, the odds are that there's now a Latin translation of it as well. Very often this Latin tends to be more difficult. It's not something you can use with middle school Latinists. But if you have a kid who madly loves Harry Potter and knows Harry Potter by heart, it's not a bad idea to have on your classroom shelf Harrius Potter et Philosophy Lapis, because they can pick that up. And part of the fun will be for them, will be comparing their memories of the book with the Latin they see in front of them. And even though the vocabulary is abstruse, when I read it, there are a lot of words that I think were either coinages or were such rare Latin that I just never run into it in my own reading. Even that side of it can get across to them an idea of like what the challenges are facing a translator, and get across to them the idea that Latin is still a language in which communication can take place. Just because something hadn't happened by 31 BC doesn't mean it's not possible to talk about in Latin. I've also gotten good responses in my high school classes to introducing epigraphy, that is writing on stone, writing on buildings. I have found that one of the frustrations that students report to me is that their parents will say, "Ooh, you take Latin, what does that building say?" And unless you have specifically set aside the time in class to talk about how to read inscriptions, they're going to have no idea. Just as somebody who knew, who had read Fun with Dick and Jane 10 times, if you ask them to read what's on the outside of the US Capitol, there's particular abbreviations they're just not going to know. So for example, on the left, this is the Pantheon in Rome. M. Agrippa LF Cos Tertium Fecit is not going to mean much of anything, even to a pretty good Latin student. And so we found it worthwhile to take time out of class and to show them how to expand those abbreviations, to know that M stands for Marcus, and to know that if you have a letter and then an F, that means son of. And so LF would be son of Lucius. To know that cos, oddly enough, stands for consul. You can use that as a springboard to talk to them about how in spoken Latin, we can tell that that sound in consul was probably nasalized into consul, which is why the abbreviation doesn't include an N. These sorts of epigraphical things can go all sorts of directions that are just not in a Latin curriculum, but they can go all over the place. We had a lot of fun recently doing, as a class, taking transcribing and translating inscriptions from photographs that students had taken and on travels with their family. And so I highly recommend epigraphy. The next thing after more extensive reading early on is to emphasize vocab rather than grammar. Again, we feel like we're being paid to teach grammar to children, and so we spend most of our time teaching them Latin grammar. But I found that far and away the greater frustration for a student when they're reading real Latin is not that they don't understand the constructions, it's that they don't know what any of the words mean. And so there's a couple of strategies I have kind of run into, and again, we'll see how many of them work, but a couple of strategies I've run into for how to emphasize vocab. One is to be okay with it if they don't know the same grammatical terminology that you learned when you were learning Latin. At this point, I have 3 grades of students who have never ever heard the term ablative absolute, and all 3 grades of those students can in fact recognize and translate an ablative absolute. They don't know it by that term. The word absolute there may have been very helpful to John Henry Newman when he was a Latin student. It is not very helpful to my students because the word absolute has changed since that term was coined. You don't have to teach them that indirect question is called that. You don't have to teach them that indirect statement is called that, because as soon as they've learned both of them, they get those two understandably confused with each other, even though grammatically they're totally different. A de-emphasis in grammatical terminology and a willingness to either make up your own cutesy names for those constructions, or maybe not name them, maybe practice them enough and show them how they work enough that it comes naturally to them when they run into it. The next point is to get away from your intro Latin textbooks vocab. This is what I call the scapha problem. My students run into scapha, S-C-A-P-H-A, in real Latin, or sorry, in their textbook Latin all the time. I've seen it in real Latin maybe once. This is a word that's sort of peculiar to the Ecce Romani books. It's not a very common word, and my students know it very well. But then sometimes they'll run into the word atque, which is one of the 5 or 6 ways of saying and in Latin, and they don't know that. I think taking time out to think about what am I hoping that they'll be able to read by the time they're late in high school, and gearing your vocabulary to that. Dickinson College has some great vocab lists that have frequency statistics, so you can gear your instruction towards, say, the most common 200 words, the most common 1,000 words. We found that's very helpful, getting people ready quickly to read real Latin. Set aside class time to practice vocab. They're not doing it at home. Some of your best students maybe, but by and large, your classes are not practicing vocab at home. This is central enough that it's worth giving up a little of the grammar lecture to give them time to study their Quizlet in class, to help them study, to help them with derivatives, help them think about things that way. It is absolutely worth the class time we found. emphasize strategies for words they don't know. I found that students have to learn even less vocabulary if they just learn that if they run into a verb they've never seen before, it's worth seeing if they can split a prefix off. Very often what's underlying it is the stem of a verb they do know. Teach them how vowel gradation works. If a prefix goes on there, facere with cone prefix to it will become conficere, teaching them that A can shorten to an I, teaching them that A could also shorten to an E. These are all helpful things that will be more of a general rule that can be expandable. So if they learn the most commonly prefixed words, they can quickly learn larger amounts of Latin. Encourage them to learn Latin words not one at a time, but two at a time. If they have just learned atque, teach them ac as well, which also means and. My colleague Phil Swanger and I give our students markup sheets that include the whole text that they're working on, that they're allowed to use on tests, provided they write no English on them, but they can draw on them, they can write other Latin on them. And I found that that's been expanding vocabulary as quickly as if you have them learn words two at a time. And then, especially if you're interested in getting into the more living Latin side of things, label everything you can in your classroom. If you have a model, if you have a world globe, label it Orbis Terrae. If you have a clock, label it Horologium. Just getting them in the sense of seeing words and connecting them with things rather than with English words is nearly always a good idea for expanding vocabulary quickly. And then lastly, keep your primary goal in mind. I don't imagine this will be the same for everyone teaching Latin. My goal and the goal of the other Latin teachers at my school is I would like my students to be able to read authentic Latin from any era well enough that they actually like it by the time they graduate. It is difficult to read real Latin, especially when they do it first. I would like to give them enough different looks at enough different eras of Latin that even if I give them the Carmina Burana, they can get something out of that. They can enjoy it. They can see the strangeness of it. I would like to be able to give them Cicero and have them not think that he's the world's most boring author. I would like them to be able to enjoy both his style and the fact that he, underneath the egotism, has actually a pretty good sense of humor. Ways you can bring that real Latin in would include just making a commitment to read that authentic Latin sooner on in their education. Again, Phil Swanger, my colleague at Thales Academy, has done a really good job of making tiered readings, that is, having an adapted version of an ancient author, a short passage from an ancient author that is appropriate for a level 1 Latinist, and then that same passage again, slightly less adapted for Latin 2, and then that same passage again in the original text. And you can have students start at 1 and work their way all the way up. You could have some of your students start at 1, and some students who are particularly raring to go, have them start at level 2. But I found that having the same reading twice, the first time adapted and the second time not, has yielded some early results. These can be a little time consuming to make, but Latin teachers are very generous about sharing them. And thanks to the Ethernet, you can always find examples of these all over. I highly recommend jeffreystedman.com. Jeffrey Stedman's been really good about sharing his school editions, not necessarily always tiered readings themselves, but it's a way of having quick vocab notes and text for a Latin text you want to read. Start every class with a quote of the day. Just take 5 minutes to do something as simple as carpe diem, where you can explain to them that no, it doesn't actually mean seize the day. That's not really what carpere means. It's more like pluck the day like a flower or carve it like a turkey. You can have that be a lead into a review of imperatives if you want to do the grammar end of it. You can have it be talking about carpe diem throughout history in English carpe diem poems. You can tell them the pecunia non olet, the money doesn't stink quote. A very simple grammar could be done even in Latin 1, and it gives you a way into talking about Vespasian, and you can talk about the Roman Empire, year of 4 emperors, the urine tax, anything you want to talk about. The quote of the day is a great way into introducing large parts of the language and the culture that will be interesting to students without committing to 2 weeks on a unit all about Vespasian. And then the one that's closest to my heart is being someone who likes medieval Latin, is to give a preference to everything that's weird and unusual and bloody over what you're supposed to read in the Latin curriculum. It's okay if they don't read Cicero. It's okay if instead you have them read the part of Statius where a guy wins a duel and then eats his opponent's head. You can do that. It's okay if you have them read Prudentius instead, where you have allegorical vices fighting in single combat against allegorical virtues. It's okay if you have them read the life of St. Columba, where you have the chance to see possibly the first written appearance of the Loch Ness Monster. It's okay if you have them read the epitaph for Petrarch's cat. These are all real things that we've read in classes recently at my school. These are all things that I've made little markup sheets for, that again contain a little vocab, contain a little grammar. And by request, I guess I could make these available if I'm not violating some Thales copyright. No, okay. So anything that, again, Latin teachers tend to be generous with things they have put forward. And then most importantly, you have to, in order for students to love what you're doing, you have to communicate your love of your subject to your students. As the legal principle has it, nemo dat quod non habet, nobody can give something he doesn't have. If you don't take the time to read Latin on your own, if you've never taken that leap outside of that same textbook you've always taught, or those same Catullus poems you've always taught, if you don't take that leap into reading something new that you haven't read, you're missing out on a great chance to enjoy something new. You're missing out on a great chance to improve your own Latin, and you're missing out on a great source of rekindling whatever it is that made you enjoy Latin. All these arguments about intrinsic reasons and extrinsic reasons to take Latin I've given are not why I ended up liking Latin at all. They're not why I ended up loving Latin. It's just because after a while I was enjoying so much what I was reading in it that I couldn't give it up. If you can't communicate that love to your students, then I would highly recommend find a Latin. They're readily available online. Everything we read is public domain. Find something new to read that you haven't read before, and see if you can find something that will kindle that love, so you can bring it into the classroom with you.
All right, thank you so much. Well, this is, I mean, this is really a treat to kind of learn. And I mean, like, you know, it's funny. My background is in Shakespeare. And so I think if you were going to add anything else to reasons why you should learn Latin, oftentimes it's like, well, you could do it in theater. But I think one of the neat things that I learned was that, you know, there was so much that I didn't realize, like we have, especially in English speaking cultures, we have such a tradition of referencing back to things in Latin, and that's kind of dying. I mean, it's really dying. It's well, that's just why most call it a dead language. But I know I remember reading Faustus and being like, half this thing is in Latin, you know, and having to really have to spend so much extra time on my own learning because I had no clue what I was reading, you know. And so I think, you know, it also just, like, in light of so many things that we watch and we listen to, you mentioned Carmina Burana, and like listening to an opera or things like that, we are so far removed from it. So I think it is such I think it almost, like, it's like a pair of those, when people can't, they're colorblind and they put on those glasses and then they can see, and like the visceral reaction they have. I feel like Latin is kind of that in our culture because it's so inundated in everything that we have, but we don't see it. So I appreciate that greatly. I am going to try and pull up some questions, and we had some conversation going through, so I have to weed a little bit out, but let's see if you all would like to go ahead and just submit any questions that you have. Oftentimes I'll open this up to Winston, or if I have anything in my head, I'll go ahead and ask while you all are formulating your questions. But please feel free to go ahead and just, if you have anything that you'd like to ask that you've thought of while Mr. Begley has been speaking, go ahead and put those in, okay? So, and I'll read those through the chat box. But Winston, I'll give it to you. And if you have any questions for.
Well, thank you again. It was a really enjoyable talk. I always enjoy hearing your perspective. You really bring just a wealth of knowledge on any subject. I love your closing lines just about, like, you can't give what you personally don't have. So what sparked, well, you mentioned it was just reading like a wide range of text. Was there a text in particular that helped spark that love for Latin?
Ooh, I feel bad for not remembering what it would be, but I don't know if I could pinpoint a particular moment where I thought, ooh, I went from not loving Latin to loving Latin. But I do know, I quoted him I quoted Horace extensively because he is sort of the author dearest to my heart, because I think as you know, I'm a big fan of poetry, and I don't think I really understood what poetry was till I read Horace. They always say he's kind of the poet's poet. So having some of those moments where I saw what you can do with a language, I think was really exciting to me in a way that even the sort of satisfaction of being able to conquer something difficult in Latin was not. So yeah, I think probably Horace's Odes, if I had to pick one thing, but I don't think it wasn't as simple as just, you know, didn't like it and then suddenly liked it.
And you've written some poetry. Have you written any in Latin as opposed to just English?
does the Fifth Amendment apply to these webinars? I think I may have written a poem in Latin. Doesn't mean it's good. And it was the medieval style Latin, which is a lot easier. That's stress and rhyme rather than quantitative meter, which is frankly impossible if you have not studied that.
But it didn't rhyme, right? Good poetry.
Oh, no, I'm a big fan of rhyme.
Really?
Yes. Oh yeah, big fan of rhyme. That might be a different webinar, but yeah, I love rhyme.
All right. Awesome. I like Winston's questions, but we do have quite a few filling up the chat box. So I'm just going to go ahead and read some of these off, and we'll try and get as many as we can. Maybe we'll go a few minutes over 5, but if it gets to the point where we do have to wrap up, it's okay. I'll send these questions through to you, and if you will, just go ahead and answer them, and then we'll send them back to you. We have your email addresses. So the first one I have is, it asks, I've been asked by homeschooling parents, when is the right time to start teaching Latin to children?
That is a really excellent question. One of the things I like the most about homeschooling is that you know your kid, and you'll be able to tell in your particular case. I think a lot of it has to do with, there's no reason to wait on Latin just because Latin is difficult. There's no reason to wait on Latin just because in school you don't start it until high school. Again, I mentioned my 6-year-old niece. She's homeschooled. She started Latin right around, like, maybe a year after she learned to read English. Her parents started giving her some Latin, and again, she loves it because she doesn't know it's difficult. I mean, it's no more difficult than anything else would be that she has to be sat down and made to learn. So she's getting very good. She's enjoying it. She's progressing slowly. I would say, depending on the academic interests of the child, I have heard of people starting as early as 5. I have also heard of people waiting till high school, the way most public and private schools do it. It will really depend on the child. I will say it can be a little more difficult to find resources if you're starting very young, but with the sort of sudden abundance of novellae, as I had on that slide, I think you'll be able to find things that are actually interesting for the age and are not terribly difficult, that are a good place to get started. That's definitely, if you're starting young, definitely label the house. That's perfect for kids of a pretty wide variety of ages.
I think labeling the house would be a great start. All right. Those books that you were talking about, do they only have Latin, or does it have English so we know what it's translated into?
That is a really good question. I don't know. I should know, but I don't know if there's supplementary materials for teachers. I believe that most of those books do have a teacher's companion, especially designed. I would think they would be conducive, again, if this is for homeschooling parents, or I think it would probably be helpful enough. I think the homeschooling parent will probably find, if they're starting at the beginning with Latin with their kid, these novellae are designed for you. They actually, there are so many cognates that I would be surprised if you as the parent didn't start to pick up a little of that Latin as well. So I think there are materials available, but don't be afraid to start Latin with your child, and you'll both be learning together. You'll make some mistakes, but I think you'll find it's not as bad as you think.
Yeah. And they won't know you're making mistakes.
Exactly.
So. How old were you when you started learning Latin?
I don't want my mother to get mad at me if I forget. This was part of my homeschool curriculum. So I think I was 5 or 6. It was one of the 2 subjects I had to be sat down and made to learn. It was Latin and math. Everything else I was doing unawares. I was doing science out in the woods all the time. But math and Latin, I had to be sat down and made to learn. And I think I was 5 or 6. But then when I went to school, we didn't have a Latin program, so I forgot it and had to relearn it in high school. And then my program got cut and I forgot it and had to relearn it in college. So again, not an expert on teaching Latin, apparently an expert on learning Latin repeatedly.
Sure. Someone asks, could you make a living off of Latin?
So far, so good. Yeah, you can. I guess you could always teach. I did sort of put in there as a joke, but I do have to say, I can't imagine not teaching. I love teaching, and it definitely pays a living. Can you make a living out of Latin itself, just Latin, like being a translator of Latin? Probably not. I don't know. There are probably people who are doing it. Again, if your main goal in life is making a living, I would say you could still major in classics in college and be just fine, because I know a lot of people who have. If you really want your career to line up with what you studied in college, first I would say ask around, ask all the people you know if their career that they love lines up with what they studied in college, and I think you'll be surprised at the answers. But let's say they do, I think you would probably could find something other than classics. But
Well, this is an interesting question because it's very simple, but I understand where it's coming from. Because oftentimes with Italians, you associate their language with speaking Italian.
Mhm.
So Latin, who made it?
Who made Latin? That is a really good question. Yeah. I'm going to say the Proto-Indo-Europeans. They didn't know they were doing it, but they did make Latin along with a huge number of other languages on the planet. It wasn't made so much as it developed, but it developed from, like most languages, a number of influences. But basically, there was this sort of mega language in Latin, Greek, all the Romance languages, English, German, the Norse languages, all come basically from the trunk of this tree of Proto-Indo-European. So there was this one kind of mega language that spread its children all over Asia, all over Europe, all over North Africa.
Wow, did not know that.
Oh, it's fun.
Someone asks, do jobs consider Latin as a second language? And I'm assuming that's maybe translation jobs or translator jobs. I'm not sure, but would Latin be considered a second language?
You can definitely put it on your resume as, other skills you have. I think generally when jobs are looking for a second language, my assumption would be, again, it really depends on the job, I would think, but my assumption would be they mean, do you have a speaking knowledge of this living language? And I would say, I would assume they would not. I think most, health clinics are not running into a ton of patients who only speak Latin. So I think in that case, it's probably not going to count as a second language when it comes to, putting this on your resume. But again, as I said, if you have studied Latin, like I can put on my resume now that I have a reading knowledge of French, I have a basic speaking knowledge of German, I have a reading knowledge of Italian, I can understand Spanish when I go to Spanish mass, there's a variety of things here where you can move from it. But yeah, I don't think I would recommend putting Latin on your resume as your second language, but you could put it under other skills.
Sure. And you've mentioned a few of these, but you were asked, what are the main jobs you can get for learning and being really good at Latin from learning?
Well, again, it depends on if you want to be using the Latin at the job. The jobs that I have encountered are, again, computer coding. Some of the best Latinists I know went directly into coding. Espionage, I guess, whatever the NSA does. I don't know if I'm allowed to know what they do. That again is something that has come out of this. As far as actually using Latin itself, you can use it in tandem with other things. Like, again, if you were to become a literary translator, and Latin, there's a lot of authors and poets I really like who use Latin on a daily basis. I would say, just in terms of the availability of the jobs and the commonness of the jobs, I think you could do a lot worse than being a Latin teacher. Again, there are more jobs than people think. I know my relatives are always surprised to hear that, oh, they still teach Latin in high school. Yeah, they absolutely do. It's all over the place. In North Carolina in particular, I think it's I don't know that many counties that don't have at least one, and very often well more than one Latin department. So as far as ease of getting a job, I think being a Latin teacher at the middle or high school level is a really good idea.
Yeah. Someone asked, do you know if in Rome, or I guess even in Italy in general, do they still speak Latin?
In a very small part of Rome that isn't really part of Rome, in Vatican City, it's used liturgically, and it's also used sort of for tourist reasons. I believe I've heard there's an ATM option if you go to Vatican City, where you can withdraw some euros using the Latin option. Wow. I haven't done it. I really want to do it. I'm gonna buy a stamp. But there are communities actually in northern Italy. There's a community in America. I think there's a kind of a loosely affiliated group in Kentucky where they speak Latin. So if you really are desperate to speak to other people, this is becoming a more and more popular thing. There are gatherings frequently called conventicula, where people get together from across the country, and the whole weekend will be a convention where only Latin is spoken. So if you're dying, if you don't like my pitch about communicating with dead people, and you do want to communicate with living people who are also nice, you can go to these conventicula and enjoy talking with other Latinites.
And Latin Mass is also another option if you want to just sit and hear it spoken. Do you have any suggestions for how parents can learn some Latin alongside of their children?
Yeah, I really just doing it. Again, all the things in the second half of my presentation about trying to get that extensive reading going early, those are things that will apply to parents as well. Also, please keep in mind that the internet exists now, and it's easier than ever to find people who have what you might think is a sort of abstruse line of knowledge. If you really want to learn Latin, I'm almost certain you'd be able to find a tutor you could meet with virtually, once in a while, who would be willing to help you along. But if you'd rather Lone Ranger it and teach yourself Latin, that can be done. I know a lot of people who've successfully done this. There are a lot of textbook lines that are designed for people learning as adults. Wheelock's Latin is very popularly used. But even just finding a curriculum and just going along with your kid, I think they'll appreciate seeing you work on the same thing with them, and they'll appreciate seeing you struggle a little bit, and they'll appreciate seeing you overcome those struggles. It's really good. It's good teaching on how to learn learning Latin.
Okay, well, these will be our last question. But someone asked, when did it really form and start? And then when did it start kind of fading out in popular use?
In popular use. Yeah, good questions. You're catching me. I think since I have a PhD, I'm not allowed to say I don't know, right? So I don't actually know. I can't give you a precise year about when Latin started. The earliest Latin literature we have is going to be, let's see, I think it would be Cato the Elder, I want to say, is the earliest one we have in large chunks. So that would be like the 200s BC, so around 2,400 years ago. It had been in existence long before that, but that's the first time we have it written down, and we have, we can see what's being said there. Somebody should double check that date, because I'm totally making that up. As far as dying out of popular usage, it carried on a lot longer than you'd think. Popular usage, if you mean when it was spoken, that's going to start to die out, 6th and 7th century. You start to see people's Latin getting noticeably shakier, and you start to see a preference for the vernacular or Romance languages influence kind of creeping in. As a literary language, it actually didn't die out at any point. People as late as Karl Marx were writing their dissertations in Latin. There's still original scholarship being composed in Latin. A lot of works that you might not think of, like there's a picture of Thomas More on the wall here, Utopia by Thomas More. It was originally composed in Latin. As far as the literary end of it, it didn't actually really go away at any point, which is why when I hear it's a dead language, I think, yeah, so what? I wanted to talk to some dead people, and they keep writing in it. So.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for just being here and telling us what you have. And honestly, I think it's one of those things that it's kind of a Pandora's box. Like once you open it, it just keeps going and going and going. And I've had a copy of Winnie Eel Pooh since I was like 12, which I've never read. So now I might go back and read it. But I would like to say thank you all. I'm going to let Winston close us out, and I appreciate everyone who has attended. And I thank you. If you have any questions, again, please feel free to email us, and we will also have this video uploaded shortly so that you can be able to view it and catch anything that you might not have gotten before. All right.
Well, Will, Alex, thank you guys both so much again. This was a lot of fun. As far as just hearing a lot of great content, it really helped me be appreciate my classical education and all the Latin that I got to learn when I was in middle school and high school. I also want to say thank you to everybody who listened to this webinar, especially my former Latin students at the Thales Waxhaw campus. Really excited, very glad that you guys attended. I do want to invite everyone to our next webinar, which is Bob's book review. And in case anybody doesn't know, the founder of Thales Academy is Robert Luddy, and he hosts a monthly book review. He picks a book that really explores a very interesting topic, ideas to challenge the mind and just help us to see the world in a better light. The next book that Bob Luddy is doing is Great Society by Amity Shays, and it's on November 18th at 5 p.m. So if anybody's interested in learning a little bit more about economics, about civics, about history, and especially the history of the 1960s and the Great Society, definitely register for that webinar. That way you get a notification once we get closer to November. Thank you guys all so much for attending this webinar. And if you have any questions, please feel free to email me. My email address is winston.brady@thalesacademy.org. Thank you guys all so much, and have a wonderful evening.